two main reasons that I wanted to get into this, and one of them I'll get into in more depth, and that's basically just like there's a lot of nonsense out there online in the urbanist space. It's not helpful, it's not healthy, it's not constructive. People may feel like they're learning stuff, but that's cool. What are you going to do about it? Is the question. I mean, and that's beside the point that a lot of it's just wrong. I want to talk about the problems that we have in detail and really get into them, but I also want to talk about what the solutions to those problems are. Man, this is ridiculous with the chainsaw shit. I don't know what that's going to sound like on playback. Okay, we're back again for now. We'll see how long this lasts for. The other reason that I got into this was because I had sort of been thinking like, well, there's so much of this online now. Like, how many younger people are thinking that this might be something that they want to do as a career? And this is also something that I've encountered at work with like junior planners. What people get taught in school and what planning actually is are not really the same thing. My grad school experience in Australia was completely different. I mean, I don't know what grad school programs are like in the US, but for me, I'd already had planning experience. And so I could tell that the program was geared towards real world work. It wasn't theory. Junior planners that I've worked with who are straight out of grad school, it seems like they've been taught a lot of theory, but not a lot of practical applications. And so, like, someone I've worked with recently has said recently that they had never heard the term current planning before. And, like, so there's a differentiation between current planning and long-range planning. And current planning is basically, like, your zoning and your permitting at, like, that side of the house. And long-range planning is more on future land use and a comprehensive plan and sort of state and federal level compliance. That would take a while to explain in and of itself, but there are a lot of different layers of regulations that cities need to include in their comprehensive plans. Long-range planning is more also like the nexus between land use and transportation. Like, you're addressing all of that stuff, whereas in current planning, it's mostly you're dealing with development applications. You're using the rules and regulations that have been created in the Land Development Code and the Comprehensive Plan, I guess, to review the development applications. People get into planning, I feel like, and their expectation of what it's going to be like is quite different from what the work actually is. I've seen people drop out because of that. Like, they spend years in school studying and then decide after a few months or a couple of years that it's not for them. And then I've also seen it where people live in a place where there's just not that much planning work, and it's really hard to get your foot in the door. And then even if you do, it can be really difficult to get promoted. But I've told this to everyone on my team who I thought was worthy of the information, that if you're a planner one, an entry-level planner, don't be a planner one for more than 2 years. If you can't get promoted here, move to where you can get promoted. Planning work is where the growth is. Development applications are really what drive the work for us. You could be in a slow growth area or even a shrinking area, and there's still planning work to be done. There's just not going to be nearly as much of it because you don't have as much coming at you. There's not as much to deal with. Or in the case of California, there is, and you just ignore it for 10 to 15 years. When I was starting out, there was no place to find advice online. The people who I was working with and for either didn't know or just had worked in the same place for their entire career and didn't have that kind of advice to give. If you're working in the public sector, especially, a lot of organizations are kind of small, and so what winds up happening is that positions open up at the entry level, and then from there, everyone's waiting for the next person to retire so that everyone can move up a rung. Obviously, the higher up in the organization you get, the fewer spaces there are. And so eventually someone's going to get passed over for a promotion. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're like not a good planner or not a good worker, but it's much easier to do when you're younger is to move to where the jobs are. I want to spend just as much time talking about real world planning and what people actually do for work as I do about the theory and and urban history and the bigger sort of global problems. All right, I don't want to speak too soon, but I think they actually might be done over there. In 1998, a good friend of mine gave me this book called Geography of Nowhere. He said, "You should read this, you're going to love it. It's the stuff about cities and traffic that you talk about all the time." He was right in the sense that I did love it, and yes, I talked about those things all the time, even back then. The two of us grew up in a railroad suburb about 25 miles or 40 kilometers south of Wall Street in Manhattan. The kind of development that the rail line had fostered from the 1880s through the 1950s allowed me a lot of freedom from about age 10 to 16 that I probably would not have had otherwise. We walked to each other's houses, we rode bikes to the beach, into town, even to the mall. Our downtown Main Street wasn't pet only when I was a kid, but we were always there hanging out, buying new cassettes or CDs, comic books, games, the arcade, hanging out at the pizzeria, getting a haircut, whatever. From the time I was about 15 or so, the train opened up a much bigger world where I had access to other towns, to New York, even to Philadelphia. As a teenager who was really into music, to be able to hop on a train to go see now legendary bands, and legendary in the punk world, play in small venues was a privilege that I was aware of even at the time. When I was 15, taking the train to New Brunswick, having to transfer at the then sketchy Rahway station, and then getting to rock out while literally rubbing elbows with college kids. I also got to meet a lot of people who I didn't go to high school with, and I was also able to hang out with them just by picking a meeting place and a time and hopping on a train. Remember, this is a pre-cell phone, pre-text message, pre-social media world, so things like that required a little extra level of coordination. It also made me realize really early on that there was this huge world outside of high school and the small town that I lived in, and that all of the people who took it really seriously were doing it because they thought that that was it, that was their world. And I kind of knew that I needed to get out of there and see more of the world. We traveled a little when I was a kid, but it was, either the kind of places you go on vacation, to the beach or the mountains, or to visit family in other parts of the country. And even when most of our family moved out of state, they moved to the suburbs of a different big city. So their lives weren't really that much different than what they had been in New Jersey. I was in the Army for a few years after high school and quickly realized that most of the country was a lot different from the places I'd seen up until then. I got to meet some crazy people and became great friends with a lot of them. And I also got to see where they lived. To call it a culture shock would be an understatement. I got out of the Army, I started college, I read Kunstler, and then I went down the rabbit hole of city planning literature, drank the Kool-Aid, changed my major to planning, transferred to the College of Charleston in South Carolina. I was a little Dunning-Kruger because the program in Charleston is great, but it's heavily oriented towards historic preservation, and that's just was never what I was really interested in. So I went back to New Jersey, to Rutgers. No, not that Rutgers, this Rutgers. The Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy didn't exist yet. The program at Rutgers Camden was called Urban Studies and was a mix of urban history, public policy, and public administration. We had some planning studios where we focused on design, but it was mostly about policy and history. It was a really great program, and I really appreciate the faculty there. I might talk about some of them more later. A lot of them have written some pretty good books over the years. But anyway, the program was more what I was looking for. But sadly, they shut it down basically right before I graduated, and they sent everyone to the Blaustein School in New Brunswick. In Camden, when I was there, I interned for the city. I worked on 2 Superfund cleanup projects. One was hexavalent chromium at the American Barrel Company.
Hexavalent chromium. Well, it's poisonous.
Yeah.
And it was pretty wild. They use it for rust proofing, like 55-gallon drums. And there's this big plume under this old warehouse that was basically going towards the river. And to tear it all up and expose it would make the plume move faster. So the solution was to cap it to prevent any like rainwater from getting in and to slow down the flushing, and then to dig up what had already leached out around the perimeter. The other project was Wellsback and gas mantle. General gas mantle was in Camden, but Wellsback was just down the road in Gloucester City. That was thorium and radium, and the extent of that contamination was insane. Like, the cleanup was not just the main 2 sites, but like all the way down the road that people went up and down on the trolley, the bars that they went to, the dry cleaners that they used, like the stuff was everywhere.
Ed Rogers reports there are no guarantees there will be enough money to finish the job.
They began tearing down a building near the site of the former General Gas Mantle Company in Camden today. At the turn of the 20th century, 2 companies in the area manufactured incandescent gas mantles. The companies coated the mantles with radioactive thorium to make the lamps glow brighter.
Here what happened is that there were actually 2 manufacturing facilities, one here in Camden, one in Gloucester, and the waste material from the thorium that they extracted, all that waste material, which was itself contaminated, was just dumped in many different places around the community.
They even had to dig out, there's a public pool, and they had to dig out all the dirt around it. And I remember you just saw this pool, this like concrete pool just sitting with nothing, with like no dirt around it. It was like an in-ground pool, but they turned it into an above-ground pool. And it's not funny, but it's a funny mental image. Yeah, I mean, Superfund and the legal liability over contaminated properties in big cities is a whole nother episode. But yeah, no one wanted to touch those properties. No one wanted to touch any property near them. That's a huge part of U.S. urban decline. These were just ghost properties. Like, cities were just stuck with them. They were saddled with them, and they couldn't turn them into tax-generating property because the city couldn't assume liability because then they'd be responsible for the cleanup. Yeah, it was a mess until Superfund was created in the 70s, and that's why basically like 15 years after, because it took a while to get the program started. It took a while to fund it. And then by the time that funding was in place, you've got to do all the studies, and then you've got to do all your geotechnical and then your engineering, like how you're actually going to get the stuff out of there and where you're going to put it. So, I mean, that's like a 10 to 15 year pipeline. 10 to 15 years out from the start of Superfund is when you see the first of these projects get completed, and then that land gets returned to productive use. And that's why in like the mid to late 90s you see a lot of big cities really start to turn around. Like, Friends would not have been made in the 80s. It was made in the 90s, and there was a whole lot of cleanup going on in Jersey City, in Brooklyn, parts of Chicago, DC, Baltimore. Those cities would not have rebounded without Superfund. After that, I started getting paid. I worked on trail planning in Camden for a few months over the summer. And then I got a full-time gig basically right after that across the river in Pennsylvania. And I don't know if I'm quite ready to talk about that yet. I might need to talk to a lawyer first. But let's just say that things seemed a little fishy over there.
What the hell is this?
It's the only place I've ever worked where I was told by my boss and the mayor, don't go to this neighborhood without a police escort. We've had problems before. And like, Camden gets a bad rap, but I mean, in Camden, I was walking down abandoned railroad right-of-way by myself, doing recon for a right-of-way acquisition for the trail network. No one ever threatened me. I never felt threatened. was never really scared about it. Like anyone who ever approached me was with some mix of curiosity, concern, confusion. No one was ever, even people who I knew were up to no good, knew that I was no threat to them. Yeah, that place was wild. Anyway, I guess the one bright spot out of that is that I got to work on a segment of the East Coast Greenway, and that was really cool. It was kind of my first introduction to that as a concept and a project. And I mean, this was almost 20 years ago, so the Greenways, there's been a lot of progress on it since, and it's getting, as more time goes by, the pace of development accelerates, and I would expect it to be complete in the next 10 to 15 years. Hopefully I'm not too old to ride the whole thing. Anyway, I got out of that city as fast as I could, and I got a job as a transportation planner at the MPO in Philly. And every city in the U.S. has an MPO. It's that's Metropolitan Planning Organization. And so all transportation spending that involves state or federal funding for any metropolitan area will go through the MPO. Something that I'll probably talk about more in depth later. Anyway, working at the MPO was a huge improvement over working down the river. While I liked the work in theory, I got really frustrated that it would take us 18 to 24 months of a federal grant process to fund a sidewalk extension or install bike racks at a train station. Also, and very surprisingly to my present day self, I did not like the academic nature of a lot of the work. Like, you would spend a year working on a study, writing it, just poring over every detail over and over again, checking the data, checking your notes, proofreading, peer review, and then you finish it, and then some mayor is going to flip through 120 pages of your study in a few seconds and then just toss it on a shelf to collect dust for 20 or 30 years until someone throws it away, and then they go right back to drinking their coffee. It was really frustrating, and that happened a few times. Even sometimes just writing studies and reports, like, you can be grateful for the work, but when you already know before you start where it's going to go, you can tell a lot of times that a political decision has already been made, that what you're doing is just cover for it. It's frustrating. After 3 years of that, I went to work in the private sector, and it seemed like a great idea in 2005, but 18 months later, I don't know. Maybe you've heard of it, but it was a huge shit show known as the global financial crisis. So I worked in airport logistics. I delivered office supplies. I moved 2 tons of freight 3 times a day by hand. One of the toughest jobs I've ever had in my life. It was tough. I was exhausted at the end of every day. Eventually, I managed a restaurant. I did everything but planning. And eventually, I'd had enough and decided it was time to get my Master's of Urban and Regional Planning. And so I did at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. It was great. The program was amazing. Academically, really tough. Yeah, I loved UQ. I loved my colleagues. I just really liked living in Australia in general. Like, after the first year, I didn't want to leave. But unfortunately, the bad times followed us, and Aussie economy took a bath. Retracing it, I guess, the Chinese economy tanked, so the natural resource exports from Australia to China also tanked. And then, but at the same time, the Australian dollar was really strong because of those exports. And basically, like, it was on parity. When we first moved there, it was like 97 cents to the dollar, and then the Australian dollar went up to like $1.10 US. Not great for us. And then eventually, by the time that we were leaving, it had gone down to 85 cents. That high Australian dollar also killed their auto exports, and the entire auto industry shut down. And Australian immigration was basically like when companies at your house for too long, and you're like, all right, everybody out, it's time to go home now. So we had to leave, and we landed in California, and I worked in bike share for a minute. Career-wise, California was no good. There are certain things that I really enjoyed about living there, and I guess I'm glad to have spent 4 years there, 5 years. But career-wise, was not a good move. I guess it's kind of obvious in hindsight. Like, if you think about the problems that they have with the high cost of housing and how little housing they build. You know, I did work in planning there, and I got some good insight to the issues. And it's not any one thing. It's really clear that they slow roll all development. It's not unusual for a big multifamily project, like say 400 to 600 unit apartment project, to take 10 years to complete. Like here in Florida, that's insane. I mean, those things usually get done in a year and a half, 2 years maybe. Just as a matter of state statute here, you couldn't even, if you were holding up the permit process, you know, like they had already submitted everything they were supposed to submit, and you kept asking them for more things after like the second or third round, the developer would just sue the city and would win, and they should. I mean, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. We'll talk more about it in another episode. But when projects take 10 or 15 years to develop, as a planner, you could be working on 50, 100 projects simultaneously and still not be busy. So there's just not a lot of demand. And then on top of that, even if there is the demand, the cities can't necessarily afford to hire new planners. I mean, they've made a couple of minor fixes to Prop 13. I hope I got that prop number right. In the 1970s, they froze property taxes at 1970 levels. Like you could only, whatever your house was assessed at in the 70s, they can only raise your taxes like 2% a year. But it's 2% of whatever that 1970s value was. So like they couldn't reassess the value of your house. And on top of that, you could pass the house on to your kids, and your kids would still be paying on that 1970s assessment. You could be living in a house that your parents left you, and you'd be paying like $3,000 a year in property taxes. But then the people next door to you who just moved in could be paying like $18,000 a year in property taxes. So basically, like the new people are subsidizing the old people, because, and basically what that means is that like people just don't move. And that also raises the cost of housing, because when you're looking for an apartment or you're looking to buy a house, there just aren't that many places to move to because no one's moving. So like a lot of California cities, their budgets are really strained. What a lot of the cities will do is hire planners on a temporary basis. So they'll bring you in for like 4 months and then maybe extend you for another 4, but they can't extend you a third time. The California law requires that they hire you full time if they're going to extend you again. They just don't have the money, a lot of them, in their budget to hire more planners. So what they'll do is they'll let their permits get backed up so that there's like a 6 to 8 month wait, and then they'll hire some temps, and then they'll blow through the backlog, and they'll get the backlog down to like 2 weeks, which is not really a backlog. That's just how long permit approval should usually take for first round comments. That's the thing, right? They'll get down to a manageable level, and then they'll just let the backlog grow, and then they'll hire temps. So yeah, California, tough. It's really frustrating living there, and I started to take it personally. There was something wrong with me, and I don't really understand it. Like I've got 2 degrees that are relevant to the field. I have relevant experience, and I was never applying for jobs that were beyond the level of my experience. It was either at my experience level or like a rung below even. Eventually I thought like, you know, I want to see what happens. I'm going to send my resume out of state. And so I did, and immediately started getting calls and interviews in Oregon, in Nevada, in Colorado, in Maryland, in Florida. I'd kind of closed in on a job here in Orlando. So yeah, I've been living and working here for 5 years and have worked for 2 different cities and a county government. That's kind of what brought me here. And I think as far as like the urbanist genre goes, one thing that really pushed me to get into doing this, as far as making videos goes, is that I hear a lot, I see a lot of things that are just wrong or not true. And what's that called? It's Poe's law, right? The best way to get a correct answer on the internet isn't to ask a question, it's to state the wrong answer because someone will correct you. I guess the other part is just explaining what planning actually is and getting people familiar with how the process actually works, because if you don't understand the process, if you don't know what levers you should be pushing, you're just banging on a wall, right? When all you really need to be doing is flipping a switch. A lot of this stuff really isn't complicated, and it comes down to politics and public opinion. In my experience, it's not actually that hard to shift public opinion. Most people already want the same things. From what I see and from what I've heard in the urbanist world, basically people saying the wrong things and a whole lot of antagonism, not really going to the right places to get what they need. Like screaming on the internet is great for clicks, I guess, but it's not gonna really change anything. These decisions are mostly made at the MPO level and a little bit at the municipal level. When it comes to like neighborhood scale stuff, that's mostly municipal. But when it comes to like a regional bike network or a regional bicycle policy or transit policy, that's all at the MPO. If you're not there being heard, you're just not being heard, and you're not going to get, like, some of the stuff trickles up, right? But there are competing interests, and if your interests are considered to be small or irrelevant, they're not going to get the attention that you want them to. There are also just the realities of moving people to where they work and goods movement that conflict a lot with what urbanists want to see. Like, for those of us in the new world, like our cities are not medieval. They're not built around a medieval core. We haven't had centuries to adapt to new technologies. Our cities were basically built around new technologies. Well, they're not new technologies anymore, but they were at the time. Dialing back the clock is not easy when the clock was already moved forward. All right, next Wednesday, part 2 of this episode, Why We All Can't Live Downtown. See you then. I'm Jim. This is Urban Legends. Thanks for watching.